My notes here simply said, imagine an arc where Luffy assembles a battalion of pirates to fight against the Marines. Now that would be a mega pog. I was excited if you can't tell. Hello my fellow weebs and welcome back to the One Piece saga, the series covering my never-ending journey of watching through One Piece for the very first time, giving my thoughts on it and ranking each arc in a tier list to determine which is unquestionably, definitively, and definitely not just in my opinion, the best one. As per usual, if you have any questions regarding the formats, the first video in the series will likely answer it. And I know it might still not be up, blame YouTube. But today we have an episode that has had me rattling my head as to how to even handle such a chonker of a story, because this one was most certainly deceptively short, as it was absolutely packed to the brim with new revelations for both new and old characters. But let's not get ahead of ourselves and take a quick look at how the tier list is looking right now. We started off the Water 7 saga with a few arcs that were a bit hit and miss for me. So, will the arc by which the saga is named redeem it? Well, there's only one way to find out, so let us jump straight into Water 7. There's something that I want to talk about right from the get-go, and that is how I noticed that this arc is the first one to directly lead into the following one. And sure, that might seem obvious on the face of it. I mean, obviously the stories lead into each other, right? But in the world of One Piece, at least so far, I've noticed that they're more so a nudge in the direction of the next story. Whereas both the entire narrative as well as the ending of Water 7 most directly lead us into the following chapter of the story. I am still a bit of a One Piece normie, but from a newcomer's perspective, it almost feels like Oda has now had enough time to experiment with grander narratives such as Alabasta and Skypiea, and is now putting all of that together in this much more mature and intricate story. But with that being said, let us get straight into the events and perhaps I can make a little more sense of what I just talked about. And because this arc is way too dense with massively important moments, we will go through it fairly quickly just to avoid being here for 3 weeks. We open the arc right where we left off, the Strawhats almost being hit by a train, which we also find out is the only of its kind in the entire world. We also meet Kokoro and her granddaughter Chimney, who point us towards a man named Iceberg. I'll say it right now, based on what we had seen so far, I could not have been more wrong about where this arc would take us. There was talk of Water 7 being responsible for building ships with the most advanced technology in the world, and that it had the best shipwrights, etc, etc. And with how much talk we had gotten about finding a new crewmate, I honestly thought that that would be our primary concern. Oh boy, how wrong I was. We arrive at Venice, Water 7, and oh boy, they were not kidding that this is the city of water. Though I won't lie, as someone who's been in Venice and spent quite a bit of time there, I would have loved to see the theme of the city explored a little more. We do of course see the Yagura bulls, which are basically gondolas, the masks, the festivals. There's obviously plenty of references towards what it is inspired by, though the in-universe character dynamics quickly take front stage in the story sense, and we don't really get to learn much about the city itself. Though I do suppose that's mostly down to preference. As you know, I just absolutely love world building in stories like these. After they arrive, they divvy up missions, but the number one priority is of course to trade in the gold for berries, and thus Nami, Luffy, and Usopp go to handle that. On the ship though, we get yet another moment between Chopper and Robin that just further cemented that genuine bond between them that I was talking about in the last video. Chopper, a little saddened, says that he has missed his opportunity to go with Nami and the gang. Robin responds that he can just come with her if he wants, to which he cheerily asks, "Really? Can we go to a bookstore?" Yes, I know these are such small moments and I'm spending a short paragraph talking about it, but based on what this arc put me through in the latter half, let me enjoy these little moments of happiness, okay? Oh, and quick note about how wrong I turned out to be about this arc. I had the suspicion that people were acting unnaturally friendly, and then the whole carnival mask thing happened. I was convinced that there would be some sort of underground higher society in this city, and that's what the Straw Hats would end up fighting. Needless to say, that wasn't even close. But I throw around so many random ideas that I think it's just fun to see which ones turn out to be right and wrong, and let you in on my thought process as well. Though as we cut to Chopper, who's excited about going to the bookstore, we get the catalyst for the rest of the arc, as a masked person goes by Robin and says CP9. Moments later, Robin is nowhere to be seen. You can probably see where my elite society theory came from. Oh, and by the way, remember when I said, if she ends up splitting off of the group, I will be very, very sad, as again, her dynamic with Chopper is just wonderful. Yeah, I wasn't super happy about this. At the same time, Zoro is ambushed on the Going Merry by the Frankie family. They're absolutely no match for Zoro, but we do get a chef's kiss of a shot as he blocks the sword. On the side of Nami, we get a very comedic negotiation between her and the clerk, which ultimately nets them 300 million instead of the initial 100 he proposed. In short, Nami is a real Chad. But with this amount of money, repairing the ship should be absolutely no problem, so they head straight for the shipyard. They meet the shipyards as well as Iceberg and his assistant Khalifa. And I won't lie, everyone confusing Kaku for Usopp because of the long nose made me laugh a lot more than I'd like to admit. But speaking of Kaku, he tells the Straw Hats that he'll be back in 10 minutes and proceeds to straight up fly across the city. First off, that is awesome. Second, that is OP. And 3, this shot is a chef's kiss. At this point, I was fairly convinced that it would be Kaku who'd be the shipwright to join the crew. Something about him just gave me those Straw Hat vibes. Though again, I'd turn out to be criminally wrong. While they're trying to figure out how they'll go about the repairs, much of their money is stolen by the Frankie family, which honestly seemed a little bit sus to me. With how meticulous Nami has been about literally anything involving money, it seems a bit weird that she wasn't watching literally 300 million like a hawk. Though in universe, I'm not too sure how much 300 million actually is, but I do suppose it being stolen just solves the problem of the Straw Hats already being filthy rich. Despite all the troubles they've already had, they continue to follow Iceberg for a tour. And wow, the factory here is a chef's kiss. But the music is a chef's kiss times 10. It gave me almost Studio Ghibli vibes. It felt truly epic. And this is indeed a trend for this arc. There are so many small pieces of music that fit in perfectly. Both later when we meet CP9 and you get that almost dark and dramatic tone, as well as these brief moments of truly awe-inspiring scenery. A short while later, Kaku returns with his assessment, and so this arc finally gets to the blasting. We learn that the Merry is done. The keel is too damaged and the ship simply cannot be repaired. Sheesh. I hate to be a broken record, but you've heard me go on about how the main crew has plot armor strong enough to survive the 7-page Muda, but I never thought that it would be the ship to be quote-unquote killed off. With how much damage it had already taken, I fully expected it to be the icon of the Straw Hats that remains throughout the entire series. I was going to say I never thought it would happen so soon, but I just realized we're on episode 233. Yeah. Anyway, this most certainly caught me off guard, though my cynical side still says that we haven't seen it dismantled. So something tells me that there may still be a Deus Ex Machina that saves the ship. In which case, you can expect a 40-minute rant from yours truly. And this nicely leads us into the main topic of the first half. That being Usopp learning of the ship's fate. And boy, did this scene with Usopp hit different. If you've been tagging along with the series so far, you'll know that even at this point, I still thought that Usopp was by far the least interesting member of the crew, despite being among the first to join. So you can imagine just how surprised I was by this sequence of events. It's almost tragic how hard he takes it. saying that he is weak and feeling so ashamed as to say he can't even face the crew anymore. So far, whenever anyone messed up, sure, they'd be angry, but it wouldn't really be a big deal. But here, Nami really can't say anything to make Usopp feel better. He is just beyond ashamed of himself. This entire sequence was most certainly deserving of the chef's keys. And as if that wasn't enough, we see Usopp go to the Frankie family alone, where he obviously just gets beaten to the ground. But again, instead of worrying about himself, he just asks about the money. The rest of the crew learns of what happened and go to get revenge for Usopp, where we get some awesome Arlong Park vibes as they head over to the Frankie house. My stupid little brain thought this would be the main villain of the arc, so yeah, but it still deserves a chef's keys. But following this absolute blasting, we get a couple of scenes that were really telling as to the themes of what this arc would be. We see Sanji and Zoro talking like grown-ups, which is of course extremely rare for their dynamic. And then we see Luffy, as serious as ever, tell them that they will say goodbye to the Mary here. I'm being serious. If all of this leads to nothing and the Mary does somehow make it, I will be massively disappointed. But if I am just in a weird phase of denial myself, then this is most certainly yet another chef's keys. A while later, the crew meets back up on the Mary to both let everyone know of her fate, as well as discuss what they're going to do about Robin. Problem is, Usopp simply is not ready to hear that the Mary is done. And despite Luffy telling him that this is indeed the end of the road and that he absolutely stands by his decision, Usopp does not accept it and challenges Luffy to a duel. And something about this just really hit me. All of these characters have gone through so much together, and suddenly it almost felt like the crew was falling apart. Not only does Robin just straight up disappear, but now Usopp is leaving the crew out of his own volition. Watching this whole thing go down almost felt like watching two best friends or even romantic partners fighting each other, despite knowing full well that they love each other. And that is just rough. There is no satisfaction of Luffy, or Usopp for that matter, getting a good shot in. This isn't a villain. And again, massive props to One Piece for handling themes such as these. The fight itself though goes exactly how you'd expect it to. Usopp does exploit a lot of Luffy's weaknesses, but obviously he still loses. And I think this shot of Nami pretty much sums up this entire thing. Where she'd usually be calling them both stupid for fighting each other, here she realizes that they are more than serious about this fight. And that piano, with Luffy just standing there and saying, "This is really rough." Even knowing that Usopp does of course end up back with the crew, things can never be the same after this. This single event has forged their relationship through literal hell. And if that isn't worthy of the chef's keys, then I don't know what will. Another aspect of this arc that I absolutely loved and I think is best brought up here is Aqua Laguna. Personally, I read it as an almost foreshadowing event that all of this is still nothing compared to what's about to happen. That is to say, all of this is just the calm before the storm. And despite this, we see so many things go wrong for the crew, but the storm still does not arrive. It only arrives at the very end of the arc, where we truly put together where Robin is being taken. It almost worked as a looming force that I just constantly had at the back of my mind, and that just really upped the level of uneasiness. But skipping ahead a little, we meet Frankie, who, as I suppose is trend with this arc at this point, I turned out to be completely and utterly wrong about. I'll be honest, at first, I really didn't like him and almost got the Wapol and even Foxy vibes, but thankfully, he turned out to be magnitudes more interesting and quickly became a character that I really enjoyed seeing. On top of that, we find out that he is a cyborg, which, if I'm not mistaken, is a first for the series. Which once again makes me question, is this a unique property, or are there other cyborgs out there? And if so, what happens when you have a cyborg with a devil fruit power? More on this later. And just before we get into the big revelations in the story, my worries about new stingers were put to rest, as we get brand new ones for each and every member of the crew. So that is a mini chef's kiss. But as for the story, we get so many reveals that I most certainly won't have the time to cover everything, but the biggest one is of course the fact that both Robin and Frankie are the keys to awakening the ancient weapon that the world government plans to use to put an end to the pirate era. And you know what that means. It is massive theory time. Based on what we've seen so far, I would absolutely love to see a story where the blueprints are actually used by the world government and the weapon is built. And to combat this, all of the massive pirate crews we've heard hints of have to band together, not in search of treasure or anything like that, but simply to survive. We'd basically have an all-out war between the pirates and the Navy, which would fit in perfectly with the time skip I talked about last time. No, I won't take off my tinfoil, okay? Anyway, as this whole thing goes down, we also find out that all of the more front stage shipwrights aside from Polly were in fact members of Cypher Pole number 9, CP9 for short, thoroughly putting an end to my assumption that we'd actually be leaving this place with a new crewmate. And speaking of CP9, as we see Lucci and the others easily dispatch the Strawhats, we get what is arguably among the biggest reveals in the series. An entirely new power system in the form of these 6 powers. Now, I won't lie, this raised some red flags for me. First off, because it is something that is apparently trainable, and this immediately creates a problematic assumption that the adversaries we'll face from now on should have also mastered this technique. Or in other words, the power floor has increased. But why do I call that problematic? Because this sort of thing starts to slowly create power creep. Now, if you know me, you'll know that I am absolutely obsessed with JoJo, and the one thing that series handles perfectly is power creep. For the most part, each and every stand user is equally dangerous if their mastery over their stand is good enough. And this was an aspect that I, so far at least, had really enjoyed in One Piece as well. You've heard me go on about, oh, that must be the most powerful devil fruit user out there, etc. But they are all beaten through some sort of creative approach. Well, with the introduction of these 6 powers, there's now an additional box that can be ticked if you want an adversary to be more powerful. Instead of just someone with the devil fruit power, they can have mastered the 6 powers as well. Thus, moving forward, after we, I would assume, defeat members of the CP9, facing someone without these 6 powers would automatically seem less threatening, right? Or, on the contrary, the Strawhats would somehow learn the powers as well, but then we have once again the same problem, because we have simply moved up the power floor. And on top of all of that, we saw Frankie introduce the idea of cyborgs. So what if we have all 3? A cyborg who has mastered the 6 powers and has eaten a devil fruit. It starts to get iffy, doesn't it? Obviously, in a series as massive as One Piece, some form of power creep is inevitable, but I just hope it remains minimal. Obviously, try to avoid spoilers if you're responding to what I'm saying here, and do keep in mind that I am purposely generalizing to illustrate the idea rather than having a super in-depth discussion about the powers. If it becomes something I want to talk about at length, I'll likely make a standalone video discussing it. But alright, enough about that. We cut to Usopp and Frankie, which is where my thoughts on him really flipped. But before we get to that, even more blasting of the feels happens as Usopp finally breaks down saying that in his heart, he knew that Mary is at the end of her life. Traditionally, I'd say that the ship having a spirit is a bit corny, but the way it was handled in One Piece just sort of made sense. Through all of the things we've seen in the series, the Going Merry has been that one constant, and that obviously carries a lot of weight. The only thing I hope this doesn't lead to is a cop-out that can be used sometime in the future. I think it worked very nicely as a wholesome send-off to the Mary, but if it becomes just a regular thing of the ship being magically repaired, then I'm not sure how I feel about that. But aside from all that, the way Frankie goes about the whole thing really made me like him a lot more. Because at first, I honestly thought he is just a clown, but as it turns out, he is actually extremely knowledgeable. Though the both of them are interrupted by CP9, who are here to get the final piece of the puzzle. That, of course, being Frankie. But before we get to that, we drift into a flashback. I mean, do I even have to say anything at this point? I probably do, because knowing YouTube, none of the previous One Piece videos are up. But yes, as usual, I absolutely loved this flashback. We find out that Frankie had actually been adopted by Tom and Kokoro after losing his family, and that he and Iceberg were basically brothers growing up. Oh, and we also see the Frog Boy, which led us to the train in the first place. And how can I not bring up the absolutely brilliant scene of Frankie standing in front of the train and begging Tom to come back? That was most certainly a chef's kiss. But as for Tom himself, his fate is honestly just plain old tragic. Despite building this train that literally saved the city, he himself essentially laid the road to his own imprisonment as he is taken to Enies lobby. But we are talking about the Strawhats here, so might we just be able to break him out and have him build a new ship? Yes, I know 22 years have passed, don't at me. Though jokes aside, I'd imagine the guy who built Rogers' ship might be able to whip up something pretty nice for the old Straw Hats. But I guess Frankie being the one to do so would fit the story better. And yes, I am indeed very keen on finding where Tom might be exactly. I know they said he was dangerous blah blah blah, but let's be real, why would they not have the world's greatest and quite literally legendary shipwrights not work for them? I know it goes against the point of getting both Robin and Frankie, but something tells me that he is still somewhere working for the world government. It just makes too much sense. Though cutting back to the present, the Mary is finally put to rest. Be sure to drop your Fs in the comments as we see the flag fly one last time. Though cutting to Iceberg, where we get yet another twist, as he explains that Robin did everything she did just to save the Straw Hats. Her only wish was for the Straw Hats to escape safely, and she does not care the least bit about the rest of the world. Sheesh. I mean, I was all but certain that she was never actually leaving the crew, but this still hits different. Though, you know how Zoro is still chilling upside down in the chimney? How is he still conscious? Anyway, two things to mention here. Firstly, Nami finding Luffy and then calling out to him while just bawling her eyes out and screaming that he couldn't save Robin was most certainly worthy of the chef's kiss. It was just a great scene with plenty of emotion. And secondly, Chopper finding Zoro. The animation we get as he cuts open the chimney was plain awesome. And on top of that, the fact that he acknowledged that the sword is cursed and that he could feel its presence leads me to believe that we still don't really know what this is about. Despite what? Like 200 episodes passing since Logtown? Give me more lore about this sword, please. But with mostly everyone accounted for, it's time to set up a plan to get to Enies lobby. Only problem is, Aqua Laguna is almost here. And I absolutely have to bring up how well the storm is handled. All the music, everything just cuts out, and we just hear the struggle of Luffy trying to maneuver through the storm and the complete chaos around him. If you haven't noticed, I absolutely love when shows embrace that vibe of complete silence and only having very few sounds be pronounced. So yes, this was about the 50th chef's kiss we've seen so far. And small note here, the fact that Luffy asks where Usopp and Sanji is, and then corrects himself to only say Sanji, was low-key sad. But finally back on their feet, Luffy gives them the final commands. they are going after them. And here, we once again get a bit of a lore dump, as Nami explains what happens once people are taken to Eni's lobby. We learn that there are only really two places you can go, those being the Navy headquarters or the ominously named Impel Down. And I think you know what I'm going to say. World building here was absolutely on point. And needless to say, with how interesting these places sound, especially Impel Down, I sure hope we get to see the crew somehow end up there. Perhaps to free Tom? Who knows? Despite Polly's warnings, the Strawhats are still more than willing to continue with the mission. Which is where we get a scene that honestly made me much more intrigued in my own previous theory about a potential war against the Marines. We see the Frankie family arrive and ask whether they can join the crew in their fight to save Robin and Frankie. And I won't lie, the alliance of the Shipwrights and the Frankie family and the Strawhats really gave me almost those Day of Black Sun vibes, as the most ragtag, varied group of people team up to pursue a greater goal. Now just imagine that, but with Shanks, Whitebeard, Blackbeard, and all the other huge names we've heard so far, establishing an alliance. Now that would have my jaw drop. And by the way, the scene where they formally lock hands is very much a chef's kiss. My notes here simply said, imagine an arc where Luffy assembles a battalion of pirates to fight against the Marines. Now that would be a megapog. I was excited if you can't tell. The entire train sequence was honestly a little hit and miss for me. Though let us start with the absolutely brilliant parts, that being Usopp returning in a disguise and calling himself Sniper Warrior Sogeking. I'll come out and say it, this just killed me. My notes here just say, what in the f***? He's getting an intro. What the f*** am I watching? I was absolutely laughing my head off here, and this was most certainly a nice break from all the seriousness. And as is trend for me with these songs and openings, I obviously heard the Japanese version in the episode, but I also checked out the English version, and it's just as ridiculously brilliant. I really recommend giving it a listen too. Though again, seeing pretty much everyone obviously recognize him as Usopp, but knowing that he has too much pride to show his face to the crew, but still wanting to help his friends was just super wholesome. And it's also here where everybody gets new outfits. Again, if you know me, the characters getting new looks in very long-running series is super important for keeping things fresh, even if the change is very minor. So yes, this was a big W in my book. I mean, look at Chopper, his little jacket is serious drip. As for the fights themselves, I wasn't really a fan of the Ramen Kenpo dude, and the fight kinda fell flat for me. Though seeing Frankie face off against Nero was both funny because of Frankie's whole cyborg stomach fridge, as well as very exciting. Zoro vs T-Bone, despite being extremely short, as usual had brilliant animation, and as you know, that is always a W for me. But perhaps the most important part comes from Usopp's interactions with Robin, because we get to see just how much CP9 has convinced her that she is the most dangerous thing to the Straw Hats. Even knowing full well that the people she's working with right now are underground special forces with pretty much no oversight, and thus not having to actually go through with their part of the exchange, she still fears so much for the crew that she restrains Usopp and continues her way to Eni's lobby. And as the Straw Hats finally get in range of Robin, CP9's true power is shown to us once again, as they are quickly defeated by the dude and his Door fruit power. I'm sorry, I forgot his name. And just like that, we have an arc where the Straw Hats have well and truly lost. They don't have their ship, they've lost a crewmate, and they're on their way to one of the most dangerous places on Earth. If that is not incredible setup for what's to come next, I don't know what is. But just before we wrap this story up, we get a super brief flashback to everyone's favorite frog boy Yokozuna, as we see that ever since Tom was taken, he has been challenging the train every single day because he never wants to lose anyone ever again. Bringing us full circle to how this arc began with him swimming toward the train. I won't lie, even if we had only seen him for like, what, 5 episodes? Seeing this super brief flashback and him joining up with the crew to save Frankie was absolutely awesome. And yes, was worthy of yet another chef's kiss. Is this a new record, by the way? And with that, we are headed straight for Enies lobby. And before we get to the ranking, since this arc did have way too many elements and details, I do want to really quickly bring up a few things that I've sort of talked about already. Firstly, and this is very nitpicky, we've seen recaps in some grander arcs already, but the ones starting in Water 7 really got on my nerves. There were episodes where the first 6 or 7 minutes were just recap. A weekly show does not need that much recap. And because I was mostly binging it, I just found myself constantly skipping like, what, a third or so of the episode? Though obviously this is purely a production thing and I'm not faulting any bit of the series because of it. It was just an annoyance that I wanted to share with you. Secondly, I love the new character designs that we're starting to see, most notably Iceberg. So far, we've seen some creative creatures and humanoids, I suppose, but whenever we see just people, they are mostly just run-of-the-mill people, right? There are of course a few exceptions like Zoro, who has his signature green hair, but for the most part, most other characters just look quote-unquote normal. So Iceberg with his blue hair and purplish lips almost gave me JoJo vibes, where the colors are often leveraged to express a lot about the character as well. TLDR, more diversity in character designs. Thirdly, and I talked a little bit about this already, but you know my thoughts on Usopp. Up until this point, he was by far my least favorite member of the crew, even after we had gotten a few more focus episodes on him. Well, needless to say, him being brave enough to challenge Luffy and the entire journey he goes through in this arc finally cemented him as a true member of the crew in my eyes. If I ever say that I'm not a fan of his character, be sure to quote this video back to me. And in connection to this, the twist that was the end of the Mary. I fully realize that I may be the one in denial here, but again, if it turns out to be a Deus Ex Machina, I'ma be real mad. Though on the flip side, as I already mentioned, the whole thing came out of nowhere for me, but it just makes sense. Compared to all the ships we've seen, the Mary is tiny, right? And the prospects of the crew being almost nomadic now that they've lost their means of transport is also super interesting. I am most certainly excited to see how this whole thing plays out. And lastly, the introduction of the CP9. This arc basically took the villains we've seen so far and turned that up to 11, both in terms of the nuance because of their whole political agenda, as well as pure power. And something tells me that we're still yet to see their full strength. So, as I think I've said 50 million times already, I am super intrigued by the idea of these 6 powers, and whether the Strawhats may learn them as well, and how they play into the wider power system of devil fruits, etc, etc. Very, very hyped indeed. And that's Water 7. An arc that surprised me in so many different ways that I think my ranking will not be very, very surprising. Everything from the Usopp story to the very intriguing political story of the CP9 and world governments, this takes the crown for the highest ranking S tier arc so far. Yup, even though this is largely a setup arc, I simply cannot ignore how much more mature the story was here. There were so many emotional moments and major hints at the future that seriously elevated the stakes for me. Especially with the crew seemingly losing Mary and heading towards such a dangerous place. And there are probably countless other things that I've simply forgotten to mention, all of which made this arc an absolute joy to watch. Though with that being said, the S tier is becoming a little crowded. So we'll see whether or not that changes after our next stop, Enies lobby. And that's the video. This one really surprised me in every single way imaginable. And since you're still here, let me give you a quick update. I can fairly confidently say that the rest of the series will return to YouTube in 2-ish weeks. Things finally seem to be sorted out. No promises just yet, but it is looking very, very good. This time, for real. But as usual, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons who allow me to produce even more of these for you all, despite fearing another copyright blasting. Speaking of which, let us give a very warm welcomes to our newest supporters, Russell and the Mythical Rod. Good name. Seriously, thank you, thank you. But if you wish to join the highly coveted Mystery Shack Insiders Club, which, by the way, will be getting the entire backlog of this series very soon as well, you can do so for as little as 1 buckaroo per month. And last but not least, let us do the usual test to see how many of you stuck around until the very, very end. Leave a comment, whatever it may be, and include the words, "It's not CP9, it's PG-13. Let's confuse people, shall we? Other than that, if you enjoyed the video, please share it and click all the YouTube buttons. But now, I want to say thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.